perhaps there won't be much to say. But today we're talking about Quintilian. Last time that we met, we talked about Cicero. We are still in the Roman era, but we are in the time of the Roman Empire. We are talking about somewhere between 30 and 95 CE or AD, whichever way that you refer to it. And we are talking about a time period when the Roman Empire is doing well. Let's just put it that way. How about that? It is still doing well. I told you that Cicero wrote the textbook for public speaking. And if that's the case, then Quintilian wrote the teacher's edition, essentially telling people how to teach oratory. His book is called The Institutes of Oratory, depending on who's translating it, but that's roughly it. And basically what it means is what the place of oratory is, how you become a great orator. And he believed that the greatest orator ever was who? I said this last time. Nobody? Who was the guy that came before him? The only other Roman we studied? Cicero. Yes, he said that Cicero was the greatest orator of all times. And he agreed with Cicero that there was a such thing as the perfect orator, and that Cicero was that. Now, one thing we do know is that Cicero died. He was murdered mainly for kind of being too powerful as a rhetorician, right? He was too powerful as a rhetorician. And so they murdered him, and with that, some say was the fall of the Roman Republic. Now we know that during the Roman Empire, that power structures were very different. In the Roman Republic, there was a decentralized government, which meant the power was in the hands of the people, and that meant that they needed to understand the process of rhetoric. But remember that the triumvirate that took over, that said we want to concentrate power more and make it more centralized, was in fact the same government that killed Cicero for studying rhetoric and for being good at it. So if Quintilian's around during the empire, when there's this concentration of centralized power, how lucky do you think he's going to be to practice rhetoric? Probably not very, right? So he loves Cicero, wants to do the same kind of work as Cicero, respects Cicero, believes that rhetoric is key to education just like Cicero. But how is he possibly going to talk about it and teach it if the last thing that happened to Cicero was he was murdered for doing the exact same thing? So what Quintilian did was he worked, because he was highborn as well, just like Cicero. Quintilian was probably a little more highborn, and he had a close relationship with the leaders that were in power. So what he did was he said, okay, they don't want me to teach the citizens, the people, how to rise up against them. So instead what I'm going to do is tell them that in order to educate their children, they must learn how to retain the power that they have. And therefore, I'm going to teach them rhetoric. That was his way of getting out of trouble, saying, I'm not going to teach it to the people who are disempowered and we want to re-empower them. Nope, none of that. I am going to teach those children of the leaders who need to learn how to retain their power. Now, in doing so, what Quintilian writes is essentially a more detailed and incredibly dry version of the textbook to say, here are the ways that you do that. And so he had to be incredibly careful with the way that he worded certain things. He could not be as grand as Cicero in saying, everybody should learn. This should be a part of everyone's education. This is where we can find our power from. This is how citizens participate. He couldn't say any of those things. Instead, he had to say, in order for you to retain your power, here is how you speak. And if you read them both, which I don't make you do, you're welcome. If you read them both, you would figure out that they're not very different. Cicero and Quintilian are very, very similar. Quintilian does say something a little bit different when he defines rhetoric or a rhetorician. He says that the definition of a rhetorician is a good person speaking well. Why is that important? A good person speaking well. The reason why that definition is important is because he adds a component to the definition of rhetoric that wasn't there before. Now, if I say, look, the definition of rhetoric is that you speak well. Does that sound right? Yeah, I mean, I guess so. It sounds a little like empty language and you just have to be good at speaking and that's it. But generally, okay, maybe. What did Cicero add to it? Did he add a person who speaks well on a subject of truth, or a person who practices the dialectic as well as rhetoric and sharing that truth? No, he doesn't say that. He says, you need to be a good person. In other words, for the first time, we are introduced to the concept of ethics as integral to being defined in rhetoric. Now, Aristotle said you have to show goodwill, right? He said you have to establish credibility. That was a certain ethic, right? Cicero obviously thought that it should empower people. There was an ethic there. And of course, they all thought you should speak the truth, right? We get this from Aristotle, Socrates, and Plato saying it needs to be the truth. And of course, Cicero. So why did Quintilian have to add, you need to be a good person? First of all, the power structures in Rome, right? Which were very centralized. And remember I said Quintilian had to be careful about how he talked about rhetoric. But they all thought that if they were high born with money, born into power, that made them good people. Good men, in this case. Now, Quintilian was sort of saying with a wink and a nod, not all of you are great people. Not all of you are ethical people. So, if you want to be a good rhetorician who maintains their power, you must be a good person. This is going to cause a great deal of trouble later because of the second thing, which is when we say rhetoric is an art or a skill, why do we add you also have to be a certain type of person to do it? So he is actually adding on to the concept of rhetoric as definitionally speaking, right? He's saying, look, I feel like I'm making up words today. As definitionally speaking, what is that? That's not even English.
We're comm majors.
You're comm majors, something like that, But I have a degree in English too, so I'm a little bit concerned about myself.
Spirit of Cicero is really good.
The spirit of Cicero, yes, it's taken me over. When we're talking about defining rhetoric, how can we add an extra layer? Not just what you do, but who you are onto it. But he did it. He did it because, again, he was teaching those who would be in power and their children who would be in power eventually. So in the Institute, Quintilian goes through, I'm glad you're sitting down for this, the 5 canons of rhetoric, exactly as Cicero did. However, he makes a few modifications. And I'll be honest with you, I struggled all night to think, is it important for me to go through every single one of those? Remember how I told you Cicero liked to talk about the color of your toga or stripping for your audience and things like that, the sort of more humorous stuff? Yeah, Quintilian takes that very seriously. and is kind of like, here's how you dress. Now remember, he's teaching people how to maintain power. So he's going to see style a little bit differently. All of them need to use a grand style when they're speaking. And all of them will need to be properly dressed. Some of these things are going to come automatically to the people that Quintilian is talking to, okay? Quintilian also thought that rhetoric was key to education. And much like Cicero, he said that education in rhetoric is from the cradle to the grave. In other words, you are going to need to start learning rhetoric as soon as you are born, just as Cicero says, and you will never stop learning it until you die. You can keep practicing it over and over and over and over and over again until the grave. But the perfect order was Cicero, so he's dead and gone, so you can't be perfect. But keeping it as a pinning of the education system. Remember last time that we talked, I said that rhetoric used to be one of the 3 R's, or 4 R's, I guess at that point, right? One of the 4 R's of education. Quintilian's work went on to greatly influence some people who were going to be studying very soon. The first person that it influenced that's very, very important that we know of is St. Augustine. St. Augustine talked about how to practice rhetoric in the church. And we'll talk about that next time that we meet. But you'll note that what he's saying here is that the church was in power, and therefore you needed to learn rhetoric to maintain your ability to preach in the church. We'll get there. The next person that it's incredibly important that he influenced was a guy named Peter Ramus, R-A-M-U-S. Peter Ramus is going to come up as someone who wanted to dismantle what Quintilian had to say. And that basically changes the trajectory of rhetoric for, until now. It changed the way people viewed rhetoric and what we believe rhetoric is supposed to do and what it's not supposed to do. So his influence, Quintilian's influence, will go on. We're going to keep referring back to a couple of things with Quintilian. One, the idea that you have to be a good person, and 2, the idea that you always have to be practicing rhetoric to maintain power, not just to get it, because remember, we don't want anybody to gain power, we want to maintain it though, right? In addition to that, someone who's in authority and speaking, and someone who's highborn and speaking, you have to be able to maintain the interests of your people and keep them motivated to serve you, right? So we're going to see sometimes, or you would see sometimes when Quintilian would be saying things that I find a little bit hard to swallow, but he was doing it so that he wasn't murdered in the streets. Seems fair, I'll give him a pass. He did have several people that he influenced in philosophy and in political science. It's not that important for you to know all of that because even I don't know all of that. But they always talk about him influencing who was probably his most notable student, who was Pliny, P-L-I-N-Y. And apparently Quintilian really influenced him. Now, most of the Pliny I've read is really about war strategy, so I'm a little bit confused as to how he did that. But I'm not a historian, so don't take my word for it. There's probably a very good explanation for it. In between Cicero and Quintilian, you might ask yourself, what happened? Well, there were like 200 years there, right? There are some questions about certain manuscripts that were found and maintained. There are questions about who wrote what and when exactly they were written. So I'm going to talk a little bit about one that may have predated Cicero It's possible Cicero wrote it. It may have postdated Cicero, and it's possible that Quintilian wrote it. We don't really know. It's also possible that there was a completely different guy named Heraclitus who wrote it. We don't know. But it's called the Rhetorica ad Herennium. The Rhetorica ad Herennium is an in-depth structuring of what's known as the stasis system. Now, you might remember that word stasis being defined multiple ways. Does anybody want to give me a crack at any of the definitions of stasis? Yeah?
Unable to move, like stops.
Yes, it is at a point of stillness, and I see that you are surprised that you got that right, but your guess is very good. Somebody else might be able to tell us how is it created, but go ahead.
Well, when we discussed it, we labeled it as the point when rhetoric begins.
Yes.
So, and in the same lecture, we talked about how rhetoric was the counterpart to dialectic speech. So I would say maybe it's like an equilibrium that's reached between like reasoning for something and
Reasoning for its opposite.
yeah.
It's when you have two equally opposing forces or ideas or concepts, right? And it creates a sense of stability there in the middle. And that place is where we have to make choices about which truth we're going to advocate for. And so it's where we make that choice and the practice of rhetoric begins. Dialectic gives us those oppositional viewpoints that come together, gives us that point of stability. Plato would say, stop there. And Aristotle says, we can't. There has to be a choice made. There has to be an argument for one side or the other. One of them has to win. There's no compromising here. There's one of them that's going to win. So the stasis system, as it were, is a legal training document, essentially. The stasis process is literally and excruciatingly described in terms of what questions should be asked and answered in what order to get what you want to get at. In other words, this is like if you go into law and you're going into the courtroom and you've got a murder case, this is the series of questions in this order that you need to ask. You need to establish definitions. You need to establish, well, don't ask me to do it correctly. It's been a long time since I've read it, and that's not what's important here. But it would be the order of questions that you would ask in order to get to your conclusion, either guilt or innocence, right? So if you're the defense attorney, you ask them that way in order to get the answers that you need. And if you're the prosecuting attorney, you would do the same thing. Now, how is it that prosecuting attorneys and defense attorneys would ask exactly the same questions? They wouldn't. What you do is you ask the same idea of the question, only in a way that's going to make your client look more guilty or innocent. Does that make sense? It's actually pretty fascinating. Law and Order tried to demonstrate this for 20 some years on TV. That's not really how courtrooms work anymore. It's a very grand way of looking at courtroom rhetoric. But at the time, courtroom rhetoric was, as we said, extremely important. There were a lot of land wars that led to a lot of disputes about who owned what land, and people needed to be able to practice in law. So the stasis system is for legal rhetoric. And again, no idea who wrote it or when. We just know it was sometime between Aristotle and Quintilian. How's that? Why do I want you to know this? Because that idea of stasis being the start of rhetoric is very easily demonstrated. You've got guilt and you've got innocence, two equally opposing forces until they get to the middle and you're at a stalemate and a choice must be made. In most cases these days, it's made by 12 jurors or by a judge or a panel of judges or 6 jurors. It just depends on the type of case and what state you're in and all that other BS that we don't need to worry about, right? But the point is always the same. You're trying to win the argument. That's it. And this is the way you go about doing it. I'm going to be honest with you. There was a time when I was like, okay, I'm going to practice this. And I was terrible at it. I was dealing with a lot of court cases down in Arkansas with my stepdaughter. And oh my God, I would be like, John, this is the way you should be asking that question. I don't think that my lawyer who drove a new Mercedes every time I saw him really gave a shit what I had to say, pardon my French. But I tried figuring that out and working with it and ended up writing a brief for one of our state Supreme Court appellate cases, different attorney, because you have to have a different attorney for an appellate court than you, and you have to make arguments differently. And it was much clearer in the appellate court how this system works. So if you're interested in law and boring yourself to death, this is something you can read. Go pick up the Rhetorica ad Herennium. It is available in a lot of places. So that is the story of that. All right, so now we know what was going on during the classical Roman period. And you know that it was a battle about power. And the more decentralized the power you had, what happened to the need for rhetoric? The greater the need for rhetoric, exactly. And so the opposite is also true. The more centralized, the less need there is for rhetoric, right? And the Roman Empire was a centralized government, and the Roman Republic was a decentralized power structure. Currently, what do we live in? A decentralized or a centralized power?
Decentralized.
Technically, yes. Okay. For now, I mean, let's hope it stays that way. My fingers are crossed. I feel good that, the systems we have in place to maintain that decentralized power are working. Good, as I say to people all the time, anything we're doing that's democratic is good. So don't get too upset based on political parties or anything like that. All right. Rhetoric maintains democracy. That's probably one of the most important statements I can make to you. It really does. All right. Questions about Rome? Okay. I was looking at the schedule and I thought today that I would talk to you about paper number 1. Sound like a plan? Everybody good with that? I will type this up and put it on Brightspace, but I wanted to come in and talk about it. I'm recording myself too. So there's no question about what your assignment is going to be. Make sense? All right. So how many of you have written a research essay before? Okay, so a scholarly paper, it's a formal paper. This one does not need to be that long. 3 pages-ish. And some people will go up to 5. I don't feel like that much is necessary, but definitely more than 2 is necessary, definitely, okay? Why, how do I know that? What is your assignment going to be? You're gonna have options for how you do this paper. And this paper is only worth like 100 points, which is only 10% of your grade. Your final paper is worth like 300 or 400 points. I don't remember which I did. So that one's worth all of the cookies. What we want to do is a couple of things with this paper. Number 1, I want you to practice demonstrating to me that you understand a concept. Okay? And we'll talk about what those should be and how you should go about doing that. So you're going to be sort of persuading me that you understand a topic, that you understand a concept that we've been talking about. The second thing it's going to do is give you an idea of how I grade. So you're going to have these papers back long before your second paper is due. Hopefully within 2 weeks of getting it turned in. Does anybody have their Brightspace open to tell me what date the first paper is due by any chance?
It's the 31st.
Of-
Experience with rhetoric?
Huh?
The experience with rhetoric paper?
No. That's just a little, what's been your experience? That's online.
I don't think it's been posted about it.
I didn't post a date.
February 24th to 28th. Yeah.
February 24th through the 28th?
Yeah.
So the 28th, it'll be due the end of February. So you've got 4.5 weeks to do it, okay? Which should be plenty. So we're talking about 3 pages at a minimum. We're talking about me getting this back to you long before your second paper is due. Your second paper is not due until the end of the semester. So we have plenty of time between now and then for you to read my comments, get my feedback, see if you need to talk with me or meet with me, any questions that you have, so that that second paper you're pretty much guaranteed an A on. That's what we're working towards. Unless you're a person who just wants a C in this class, in which case we can work on just getting you a C. Yes, ma'am.
Would it be too out of the way to like email you a draft of it to get notes on it before
The first paper or the second paper?
the first paper? Or,
Let's do that for the second paper.
Okay, cool.
Generally speaking, you'll probably find that sending me your first paper isn't going to get us very far because it's short, it's just a topic, and I mean, if you want to email me and say, here's what I'm thinking about doing, how does that sound, or, that's fine, but I don't know that a draft is necessary. For your second paper, I could totally see people wanting to turn in an early draft that said, is the whole paper, but is a draft that I can look at and give feedback on. That will totally be fine. I offer that every semester, and very few people take me up on it, just saying. But it would be a good idea, I always thought, boy, if I give my teacher the paper first, and they tell me the feedback, and I do that, I better be getting an A on that paper, right? That was how I always saw it. Like, hold me to a standard that I hold you to. So, there are going to be 3 options for this paper. It's choose your own adventure, if you will. Option A is as wide open as it gets. Pick the concept and demonstrate to me that you know it. That's it. The question you're going to ask me is, how many sources do I have to have? And I'm going, because you all are high pitched. And I'm going to say as many as necessary to demonstrate to me that you understand the topic. Now, what are good sources for you to use? Well, let's talk about what aren't good sources. Don't go to Google, type in the concept, and take the first 3 sources of information. That's not a good way to do this at all. Concepts in rhetoric are extremely fluid, and they are used in different ways across a ton of subjects. So you want to make sure that you are getting the best sources that you can get. And they're really easy to get, and here's why. So we're studying concepts that come from ancient Greece, ancient Rome, and the medieval period. Luckily for you, all of those manuscripts are considered classic works, which means they're all available online. If you type in Aristotle's The Rhetoric, you can find the full books of the rhetoric. For Cicero, the Institute's 12-book series. You can find all, now when we say books, they don't mean like what we mean, You can find all 12 books in, the best translation, the best edition that you can get online. So you don't even need to go to the library for this thing. Isn't that fantastic? And you're getting external scholarly sources. Now, it may be that you're like, look, I want to do a little more digging. I want to find some journal articles that talk about this. That's fine. Use the EBSCOhost, see what you could get. Go on Google Scholar or whatever. Make sure that the information you're giving me is coming from a scholarly source. Let me tell you some things that are not scholarly sources. An encyclopedia is not a scholarly source. A web page is not a scholarly source. Someone's class notes are not a scholarly source, and someone else's syllabus is not a scholarly source, and someone else's lecture is not a scholarly source. And the reason why I say that is when we throw stuff online that we're like, here, this is free to whoever wants it, we're talking about our individual class and what goals we're attempting to achieve. That might not always be what we're doing in here. So I base everything that I give you off of the scholarly studies that I have done. That is where you should get your information. Make sense? So if you're going to talk about, I don't know, style, and you're going to use mainly Cicero, who should I see in your reference page?
Works of Cicero.
Cicero, yeah, that would be great. If you could do that, that'd be great. I mean, if you have other stuff too, that's fine. But I should be seeing some original interpretation somewhere. Your textbook is not a scholarly source. A textbook from another class is not a scholarly source. Those are all sort of what we might call internal sources, not external sources. External sources have been reviewed. They have been agreed upon by the general scholarship done in the field, okay? Does anybody want me to schedule a day at the library for us? Didn't think so, okay. That's fine, that's okay. I get offered every single year, people are like, we noticed that you were teaching a writing course. Would you like to have an individual one-on-one with your class by this librarian? They're just gonna show you what you probably already know by the time you're a junior in college, so. Excuse me, at least what we hope you know by now. So the question next is, what is the second option? The second option is incredibly strict, okay? This is, so if you're a person who needs a lot of structure, this is probably your best bet. Option B, compare and contrast Aristotle and Plato's views on rhetoric. Now this can be kind of fun because there are different people who interpret Plato's version of understanding rhetoric differently than I do, and that's okay. As long as it's cited as a, as long as you cite the source you got it from, you're fine, even if I disagree with it. Academics disagree all the time. As long as you can back it up, you're good. Make sense? But compare and contrast Aristotle and Plato's views on rhetoric, not how they grew up or where they grew up or how many times Aristotle was banished. None of that. I don't need any of that. What I need is their views on rhetoric specifically. Compare and contrast. If it's only a 3-page paper, yeah, it's going to take you at least 3 pages to go through that, right? That's why I'm saying 3 to 5 pages. Demonstrating your knowledge on a concept should take you at least 3 pages. That's why I said it where I did. C, your final choice, which is not as open as this one, not as dictatorial as this one, which is to answer a question, which is very simple. Okay, how was rhetoric maintained in the medieval period? Now, we haven't gotten there yet, but we will before we're going there next week, so before your paper is due, obviously, so you'll learn a little bit about that. I want to warn you of one thing with the sources on this particular subject matter. Some of the theorists claim that the medieval period began with, like, in the time of Quintilian. Quintilian died in 95. don't really think the medieval period stretches back that far. If it does, it's much longer than I was ever taught that it was. Most people place the medieval period, let's say that you're being particularly generous with the age, somewhere between 400 and like maybe 1600. So that's like 1400 years. That's a lot of years, okay? I'm not sure it quite lasted that long. I tend to be more of the 400 to 1200, maybe somewhere in there. I'm pretty sure by the time we get to the 14th century, it's kind of changing a little bit, okay? Now, it takes a long time for us to change paradigms in the way that we think. I mean, clearly we didn't go from Plato to Cicero like that, even though we did it in this classroom. A lot of years went by, 500 or so, 600 or so. So, however you define the medieval period, I don't agree that this includes Quintilian, okay? Make sense? All right. So, what do I mean by pick a concept? This can be as simple as ethos and doing a deep dive into what ethos is. It could be something as complex as power in the Roman Republic and Empire. That's a much more complex thing, but it could be that. Literally any concept you want, from the smallest to the biggest, the idea of inartificial proofs. The artificial proofs, there's 3 of those. Like, whatever you want to spend some time on, just remember that whatever you pick, you're going to be spending some time with it. So you're going to be looking at the details of it. Makes sense? Whatever you do not choose rhetoric as a concept, okay? That's too big, right? Dissertations aren't even written on rhetoric. That we left to Aristotle, and let's leave it back there, okay? The compare and contrast Aristotle and Plato's view on rhetoric, I already talked about that a little bit, but just to make the point clear, I am not looking for their personalities. I am looking for their views on rhetoric. And then, of course, how was rhetoric maintained in the medieval period? This is something you might pick a particular theorist during the medieval period and say, this was how rhetoric was maintained. You might talk about the sophistic movement during the medieval period, because the sophists were always here. We've always had sophists. Those never go away. People will always want to make money off of us. Who's that famous motivational speaker? Tony, I can see him. Big mouth, huge teeth. Anyway, I'm going to remember it as soon as I walk out the door. Somebody online watching is probably screaming it at me right now. Anyway, how you might look at a particular concept that was maintained for rhetoric throughout the medieval period. You might find that you want to focus on what the use of rhetoric was. Because remember, this is a time, I'm already starting my lecture for next week, this was a time when the church controlled everything in the Western world, okay? Particularly the Holy Roman Church, right? It controlled everything. So how was rhetoric involved in that, you know? Or how did it get maintained when most people weren't learning anything? You know, they were all plowing in the same field for generations, literally. We'll talk all about that next week. Are there questions on this part of the assignment so far? Does that give you enough options and yet enough structure? Okay. All right. How am I going to evaluate this? On Brightspace, you will find that I have a pretty complex rubric there. Don't freak out. I'm pretty sure that if you read that rubric, you will find that you need to do things like use good grammar, proper punctuation, correct citations, the APA style format. Are we all familiar with APA? Okay. APA style format, you've got to reach a certain minimum number of pages, and that's 3. That does not include a title page, does not include a reference page. You want to make sure that it's organized and that I can tell what the organizational pattern is. And you want to make sure that you have an introduction and a conclusion. Everybody forgets that just like your COM 115 speeches, there are introductions and conclusions to papers. In addition to that, make sure that what you're saying makes sense, that there's some logic to it, right? And whenever you make a claim that seems to you like it had to come from somewhere else, put the reference down. Not that hard, right? Whether you're quoting it directly or paraphrasing, just put it down. Now, the question always is, how do you cite sources like Quintilian, Cicero, and so on? It used to be that we required you to put down what edition, what translation, all the page numbers, that kind of thing. We've gotten away from that, and we now do, you could just do Cicero or Quintilian or Plato. Yes?
So if I like a totally random example, if I went to page 50 of this book with Cicero and I found this perfect quote, I could just put in quotation,
Parenthetical.
yeah, parentheses, Cicero. That would work?
Yep.
Okay. Cool.
I know, and I hate it, but here's the thing. Since we've put a lot of these books online, I don't know what version you're using and what website you got it from, right? So screw it. I will be able to find the site. If there's a quotation out there by Cicero that you've gotten, I can find it,
Okay.
right? All I have to do is cut and paste it and it will show me. So the reason we use APA references in communication is because we need to know where your information is coming from. Most of these classical theorists, we know what we're reading, right? We've gone over them with fine-tooth combs. It's going to be okay. And I would just warn against reading somebody's take on Cicero and then saying that that's Cicero, right? And I did used to get citations like Aristotle, 2005. And I'm like, what did you do? Ouija him back? Like, how did this... Because people never understood, we don't need a date. What we need is the translation, right? What year was it translated? Who was it translated by, etc. So just forget all that. Now, when you get to writing probably post St. Augustine, then you will be required to tell me dates and page numbers and everything, because those books are actually printed usually and do have editions that, I would need some direction in finding. And so the next question is, how do I cite a source that I found online, right? And there is a specific way to do that, and I will make sure that I post that somewhere and talk about it. Make sense? Just so you guys have examples. Now, if you're really concerned about source citations, another place you could go is the Purdue University Library OWL site. Literally, if you type in OWL, Purdue, and APA, you can see not just the APA style book that you have to search through, but they also have examples. They have paper samples. Just go down and look at how they're citing things, and voila, you got it, okay? So don't be too concerned, but yes, I will put out how to cite a work that's online, especially for your second paper, because that's where you're most likely to need that information. Okay, so that will be evaluated as part of your paper, as well as the rest of it. Next question I usually get is, well, what's going to be the rubric for our second paper? And the answer is the same as the first. One rubric, because your paper should do those things. Recommendations on how to get an A. For the love of all that you hold dear, reread your paper, okay? I get so many sentences that don't make any sense. And I know they're not smart enough to have come from AI. They just don't make sense. If you reread your paper, you go, oh goodness, how did I end up with a sentence that starts with and ends with a period in the middle of this thing, and it's like 3 words long? How did that happen? How did one sentence become a paragraph? You will catch all of those little things by just doing that one simple thing of rereading your paper. If you're like me, you hate rereading your own work. I hate it. It's a terrible thing to do. This is why I don't write books, right? I don't want to know. I don't care. I don't ever watch my recordings of myself. I don't want to know how good or bad I was that day. Like, we all want to ignore it, but you can't, right? Because it's coming to me and I'm evaluating it. So if I'm evaluating you and I give you my standards for how to do it, the best thing you could do is reread your paper. And if you really are dedicated to getting an A, go through my rubric and make sure you've met all of the high standards that you want to meet or the mediocre standards that you need to meet, right? And remember that doing the minimum does not get you a C. What do I mean by minimum? I mean minimum effort on everything does not get you a C. That means you turned in the assignment, which at best is a D minus. We got to work up from there. So don't make the minimum your standard, okay? The average student does not just do the minimum, seriously. So if I'm going to give out C's, it better be based on a true average, okay? Questions, comments, concerns. Your exam is coming up too, I believe. When do I have that for? Does anybody remember?
17th to the 21st.
February, right? Okay, so about 3 weeks. So here's how these work. I will put them up usually on a Friday night, and it will be open until the next Friday night, so a full 7 days. It'll be online. It's open book, open note, open lecture, open everything. You can take it whenever you want. Normally they take less than an hour, but take as much time as you freaking want. The only catch to this is that you can only take it once. So whatever you do, if you haven't finished it, don't close the window. Just leave it open until you come back to it, okay? But you'll have that whole week to do it. I don't advise waiting until the final night, like 2 hours before it's due. That always causes problems. I don't know why, but if there's gonna be a disaster, that's when it's going to happen. Don't make that happen for yourself. I don't accept that people forgot to take the test over the course of a week, because I constantly remind you, and also Brightspace constantly reminds you, paper due, test due, whatever, okay? So, why do I do exams this way? Because I want to know what you know, not what you don't know. I don't care what you don't know, what you don't have memorized. Screw that. I want to know that you either know the answer or you can find the answer. In addition, I think tests are dumb in a writing class, right? Because it's supposed to be about writing more than anything. The third thing I want to say about the exam is that it will be multiple choice or short answer, not short essay, short answer questions, okay? I do not give feedback on individual questions on the exam. So if you get something wrong and you really don't know why you got it wrong, let me know and I will write back the response. I will get that set. But nobody ever reads my responses, and when it's multiple choice, it's like, okay, the answer was B. You know, like, I mean, come on, you know? So we can, hopefully that's good enough for you. On the papers, I will be entering feedback into Brightspace, so it'll go right back to you with your grade. Does that make sense? All right. Any questions at all? Okay, we'll end a little early today. I've got a Franklin Delano Roosevelt dinner to go to at 5. So have a good weekend, and I will see you on Tuesday.
Is he gonna be there?
Franklin?
Yeah.
Doubtful. I mean, I think we'd really have to pull up a radio and a Ouija board or something.
In spirit.